What up, doe? Welcome to the D. From the concrete of Gratiot to the hustle of 7 Mile. From the parties at Hart Plaza to the late nights on Jefferson. This is Detroit Tales and Stories, where the Motor City's realest stories come alive. We're taking you back to when the streets had their own rules, when your whip spoke louder than words, and when survival meant everything. The mid-'80s to the 2000s, when Detroit was raw, uncut, and unforgettable. These are the stories they don't tell you about, straight from the heart of the D. Detroit Tales and Stories. Real stories, real Detroit, real talk. Episode 2, When the Streets Become Family. Welcome back to Detroit Chronicles. It's still summer 1991 and 15-year-old Quentin Quack Williams just learned that the westside has different rules than the eastside, but sometimes the streets have a funny way of turning enemies into family. Chapter 7, The Unexpected Turn. As summer stretched on, something funny happened. Mike City and his cousins, Marcus and Larry, kept showing up around the neighborhood. At first, it was more of that same energy, that territorial testing that young men do when respect is on the line. But gradually, the hostility turned into something else. Marcus, who looked like he could have been on somebody's album cover with his light skin and smooth features, had a way with the neighborhood girls that was almost artistic. He'd lean against car hoods and sing to them, actual singing, not just rapping, and they'd melt like ice cream in the Detroit sun. Larry was the coolest cat Quack had ever met, with a laugh that made everybody around him feel at ease, and a confidence that wasn't about proving anything to anybody. And Mike City became the big brother Quack never knew he needed. "Come here, young dog," Mike would say, pulling out a bottle of Heaven Hill bourbon that looked like it weighed more than Quack did. "You need to learn how to be a man out here." Chapter 8, The Education. At 15, drinking that cheap whiskey felt like swallowing liquid fire, but Mike and his cousins treated it like a rite of passage. They'd sit on Grandma Pearl's porch after she went to sleep, passing that bottle around and talking about life, girls, money, and the kind of dreams that seemed both impossible and inevitable in 1991 Detroit. Sometimes they'd have J Dilla's beats playing low from a boombox, or debate whether Detroit's Most Wanted was better than AWOL. "Check it," Mike would say, his voice getting philosophical the way people do when alcohol loosens their tongues. "These streets gonna teach you whether you're ready or not. Better to learn from your brothers than learn from your enemies." The night Quack got so drunk on Heaven Hill that he passed out on his grandmother's front lawn became legend. Mike and Larry carried him to the door, knocked, and when Grandma Pearl answered, they gently propped him up so he fell right into her arms. "Evening, ma'am," Larry said with that smooth smile. "Your grandson had a little too much education tonight." Grandma Pearl looked at these West Side boys who'd been terrorizing her grandson just weeks before, and somehow understood that the streets had their own way of making family. She never said a word to Quack about it, but she started keeping extra food in the house for when Mike and his cousins came around. Chapter 9, The Real Learning. By August, the four of them were inseparable. Mike City taught Quack the difference between eastside flash and westside substance. Marcus showed him how to talk to girls with respect instead of just trying to impress them. Larry demonstrated that coolness wasn't about what you wore or what you claimed. It was about how you carried yourself when nobody was watching. And slowly, Quack began to understand that throwing away that blue rag hadn't been about disrespecting his eastside roots. It had been about learning that respect wasn't something you wore in your back pocket or spray painted on walls. Real respect was earned through how you treated people, how you handled conflict, and whether you could admit when you were wrong. The summer of 1991 became the summer everything changed for Quentin Williams. By the time school started again and he had to go back to the east side, He wasn't the same kid who walked down Dexter Avenue with a cheap bandana and too much pride. He was family now, Westside family, and that meant something different than anything he'd ever known. Chapter 10, The Lesson Learned. On his last night at Grandma Pearl's before school started, Mike City pulled him aside as they sat on the porch. Someone down the block was playing that new Slum Village joint that was making rounds on the underground mixtapes. "Yo, Quack," he said, using the nickname that somehow sounded different coming from him now, like a term of endearment instead of a target. "You learned something this summer?" "Yeah," he said finally. "I learned the difference between thinking you're respected and actually earning it." Mike nodded, satisfied. "That's real talk, young dog. Don't forget that when you get back to your side of town." As Quack packed his bags the next morning, Grandma Pearl watched from her kitchen window. She's seen a lot of young men come and go from these streets over the years, and she could tell the difference between the ones who learned from their mistakes and the ones who didn't. Her grandson was going home with something more valuable than any gold chain or fancy sneakers. He was going home with wisdom. And in 1991 Detroit, that was the most precious thing a young black man could carry. Chapter 11, The Return. The D-Dot bus that took him back to the eastside felt different now. Same cracked vinyl seats, same diesel exhaust smell, same view of abandoned buildings and liquor stores. But Quack looked at it all with different eyes. Eyes that had seen what happened when you confused flash with substance, when you mixed up territory with respect. By the time he got off at 7 Mile and Van Dyke, back in his own neighborhood, he knew he'd never be the same. The East Side would always be home, but that summer on Dexter Avenue had taught him that family wasn't about where you were born. It was about who had your back when everything went wrong. And sometimes, the people who check you the hardest end up being the ones who love you the most. Walking through his old neighborhood, seeing the same corner boys, the same hustlers, the same dreams wrapped up in gold chains and fresh sneakers, Quack understood something new. In the distance, he could hear someone's car system bumping that Detroit's most wanted track, "Money is Made." And for the first time, the lyrics hit different. Respect wasn't about the colors you wore or the set you claimed. It wasn't about the neighborhood you came from or the crew you ran with. Real respect was about the man you became when everything else was stripped away. And that summer on Dexter Avenue, surrounded by the heat and the music and the smell of barbecue mixing with motor oil, Quentin "Quack" Williams had learned to become a man. Chapter 12, The Legacy. Years later, when people would ask Quack about that summer, he'd always talk about the 3 cousins who changed his life. Mike City, who taught him that strength wasn't about how hard you could hit, but how willing you were to admit when you were wrong. Marcus, who showed him that real players didn't take what they wanted, they earned what they deserved. And Larry, whose cool confidence came from knowing exactly who he was, whether anybody else understood it or not. The blue bandana he'd thrown in that garbage can on Dexter Avenue became a symbol of everything he'd left behind. Not his East Side pride, that would always be with him, but the ignorance that came with thinking respect was something you could buy at Woolworth's for $3. Detroit in 1991 was a city learning to survive. The crack epidemic was tearing apart families. The auto industry was bleeding jobs, and young black men were caught between dreams that seemed impossible and streets that offered quick money with deadly consequences. But in the middle of all that chaos, on a hot summer day, when Detroit's most wanted was the soundtrack to every corner and the heat was rising off Dexter Avenue like a mirage, 4 young men learned something that would stay with them forever. Family isn't just about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who care enough to check you when you're wrong, who teach you lessons you don't want to learn, and who have your back even after you've proven you don't deserve it. That's the real Detroit story, not just the music and the cars and the fashion, but the way the streets could break you down and build you back up in the same summer, the way enemies could become brothers, and the way a cheap blue bandana could teach you everything you needed to know about respect. Chapter 13, The Wisdom. As Quack walked through his eastside neighborhood, seeing it with new eyes, he realized Grandma Pearl had known all along what would happen that summer. She sent 2 young boys to the westside, knowing the streets would teach them lessons she couldn't, knowing that sometimes you have to lose your pride to find your respect. The cousins he'd grown up with, the crew he tagged walls with, the whole eastside identity he'd worn like armor, none of that had prepared him for the real world the way one summer on Dexter Avenue had. Mike City and his cousins had done more than just check his ego. They'd shown him what it meant to be a man in a world where manhood was measured by how you handled adversity, not how you avoided it. And that lesson, learned in the heat of a Detroit summer, with the taste of Heaven Hill on his tongue and the sound of underground hip-hop beats echoing from car stereos, would stay with Quentin Williams for the rest of his life. Because sometimes the best teachers are the ones who start out as your enemies. And sometimes the most important lessons are the ones that hurt the most to learn. That was the summer Quentin Quack Williams learned the difference between respect and reputation, between family and blood, between who you think you are and who you really need to become. This has been Detroit Chronicles, bringing you the real stories from the streets that raised us, the music that moved us, and the lessons that made us who we are. Until next time, remember, in Detroit, every block has a story, and every story has a lesson. That's another chapter from the Tales and Stories, fam. If these stories take you back to the D you remember, or help you understand the D you never knew, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Drop a comment and tell us your Detroit story. What block you claimed, what party store you remember, what ride you were pushing. Follow us on the gram at Detroit Tales and Stories for behind the scenes content and rare photos from the era. Until next time, keep the D alive in your heart. Peace.